History is more than just time gone by. It is the echo of power and courage, of ideas and intrigue. From the pharaohs of Egypt to the revolutions of the modern age, every era has its heroes, its shadows, and its secrets. We dive into the stories that changed the world, revealing what truly happened and what was never told. Welcome to Diary of History, where the past comes alive.
We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender.
Freedom and justice, I have a dream.
Chapter 1. Introduction. What is the Mafia? The Mafia is a phenomenon that has shaped the history of Italy, especially southern Italy, for over a century, attracting worldwide attention. But what exactly do you mean when you talk about the Mafia? For many, the term is closely associated with images from films and novels. Men in dark suits, secret meetings in smoky rooms, blood feuds, vows of silence, and a strictly hierarchical organization that exerts influence in all areas of life. These images are not fictitious, but they only take up part of reality. Behind the myth is a complex social, economic, and political structure that has grown over decades and has always adapted to new circumstances. The term mafia is often used today as a collective term for various criminal organizations that have emerged in Italy. In fact, there is not just a single mafia, but several groups with different regional origins and peculiarities. The best known and oldest is the Cosa Nostra in Sicily. In Naples and Campania, one speaks of the Camorra. In Calabria of the Ndrangheta, and in Puglia, there is the younger Sacra Corona Unita. All these organizations share certain characteristics, but differ in their history, structure, and ways of working. The core of the mafia system is the combination of criminal violence and social power. The mafia is not just a gang of criminals who earn their money through robbery, smuggling, or extortion. It sees itself as a kind of parallel authority that has an impact on society and the economy. The key to this lies in the concept of honor and omertà, the vow of silence. Anyone who belongs to the mafia commits himself to absolute silence towards outsiders, especially towards the authorities. Treason is considered the worst crime and is almost always punishable by death. This principle has made the mafia almost untouchable for generations, as for a long time it was almost impossible for law enforcement to collect evidence or compel testimony. The mafia has its roots in a historical situation marked by poverty, social inequality, and a lack of trust in state institutions. In Sicily, for example, the state was weak in the 19th century, and many people lived in remote villages where law and order were hardly enforced. Here, the mafia took on a kind of dual role. On the one hand, as a protecting power that promised security and order, and on the other hand, as an oppressor who exercised power through violence and threats. This area of tension between supposed protection and criminal exploitation still forms the foundation of mafia-like structures today. At its core, the mafia is based on a network of families. These families are not mere kinship groups, but criminal organizational units that function like small businesses. They have a leader, the so-called capo or godfathers, below other levels of members with specific tasks. The structure is strictly hierarchical, but also flexible enough to adapt to the circumstances. Loyalty, silence, and a willingness to use violence are the central values that define membership. Unlike ordinary criminal gangs, the mafia is not limited to illegal activities. She is a master at infiltrating legal structures and using them for her own purposes. Construction companies, restaurants, transport and trading companies, many seemingly normal businesses have and continue to be used for money laundering, smuggling, or influence. In this way, the boundaries between the legal economy and organized crime are blurred, which makes it even more difficult to fight it. Another essential element is the close connection between the mafia and politics. Early on, the mafia understood that its power could not be based solely on intimidation and violence, but also on political alliances. It offered politicians voices and influence in local communities in exchange for protection from prosecution and access to state resources. This relationship was particularly pronounced in Sicily, where entire political careers rested on the tacit support of the Cosa Nostra. But the interplay between the mafia and politics also played a decisive role in other regions of Italy. Internationally, the mafia gained fame and power primarily through its role in the drug trade. Since the 1950s, Cosa Nostra has been significantly involved in the heroin trade between Europe and the USA. It organized production facilities, smuggling routes, and distribution networks that brought in billions. The Camorra controlled cigarette smuggling in the Mediterranean region for decades, while the Ndrangheta rose to become the most important European player in the cocaine trade in the 1980s. This expansion made Italian mafia organizations global players in international crime, whose networks reach far beyond Italy. At the same time, the mafia exists in an ambivalent relationship with society. Many people, especially in structurally weak regions, sought protection from the mafia or worked with it, whether out of fear or out of pragmatic calculation. The mafia often took on tasks that the state neglected, such as enforcing contracts or arbitrating disputes. However, this seemingly useful feature camouflaged the brutal reality that the mafia is ultimately a system of blackmail that maintains its power through violence and fear. For decades, the fight against the mafia presented the Italian state with enormous difficulties. It was not until the 1980s and 90s that spectacular trials, courageous judges, and increasing international cooperation succeeded in breaking the silence and exposing the structures. The fight against the mafia claimed many victims, including famous investigators such as Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino, whose assassinations shook all of Italy in 1992. But even though great successes were achieved, the mafia remained a flexible, adaptable system that always found new ways to secure its power. In the introduction to this script, it becomes clear that the mafia is more than a criminal phenomenon. It is a social, political, and cultural system that is deeply rooted in the history and structures of Italy. It is a reflection of the weakness of state institutions, social inequality, and the ability of crime to entrench itself in legal structures.
Chapter 2: The Origins of Sicily in the 19th Century. To understand the origin of the mafia, you have to look at Sicily in the 19th century. During this time, the island was a region full of contrasts, marked by poverty, social tensions, and a weak state that was hardly able to maintain order. Until 1860, Sicily belonged to the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, a state determined by feudal structures and whose social order had hardly changed for centuries. Much of the land was owned by large landowners who often did not live on the island at all, but resided in Naples or on the mainland. The work on the vast estates was done by poor peasants who had hardly any rights and were in absolute dependence. This absence of the landlords led to middlemen, so-called gabellotti, taking over the management of the estates. They leased land, ensured the protection of the harvest, and kept the workers in check. Since state institutions were weak and inefficient, the gabellotti developed into local rulers who secured their authority not through state laws, but through violence, threats, and private militias. Here we find the first seeds of mafia-like structures, a system of private violence that replaces state power and is at the same time linked to economic interests. The state, which was already weak in the first half of the 19th century, lost even more influence in the turmoil of the Italian unification movement. When Giuseppe Garibaldi conquered Sicily in 1860 with his legendary train of 1,000, and the island was soon incorporated into the emerging Kingdom of Italy, hardly anything changed for the population. Although the old feudal structures formally disappeared, the social conditions remained. The peasants remained poor, the large landowners powerful, and the new Italian state had neither the means nor the authority to fundamentally change conditions. It was precisely in this vacuum that the mafia-like networks unfolded. They offered protection where the state was absent, while at the same time using violence to advance their own interests. Anyone who wanted to lease land had to come to terms with the forked lotus, and anyone who wanted to trade needed their consent. This system was based on loyalty, silence, and interdependence. This already shows what would later become the core of the mafia, the combination of economic power, violence, and social control. Another important factor was the culture of distrust of the state. For many Sicilians, the state was a distant, foreign institution that guaranteed neither security nor justice. Instead, people relied on family ties, local communities, and informal networks. The mafia continued this tradition and established itself as a kind of alternative force for order. It presented itself as a protector of honor, as a guarantor of security, and as a mediator in conflicts. Those who turned to the mafia did not receive a rule of law in the modern sense, but quick and often brutal solutions. Social tensions in Sicily intensified in the second half of the 19th century. After the unification of Italy, many farmers hoped for a land reform that would give them more rights and property. But these hopes were disappointed. Instead, living conditions deteriorated and hunger riots shook the island. In this situation, the mafia gained further influence as it acted as an intermediary between the impoverished peasants and the rich landowners. Not in the sense of social justice, of course, but in order to expand its own power. The wave of immigration that began toward the end of the century was also an expression of this social crisis. Hundreds of thousands of Sicilians immigrated to North and South America because they saw no prospects in their homeland. With them, mafia-like structures also spread to the New World, especially to the USA, where the Cosa Nostra would later become a global term. In the late 19th century, the Italian state also began to perceive the mafia as a serious threat. Politicians and intellectuals first coined the term mafia, which quickly became synonymous with criminal organization and secret power. But the attempts to fight the mafia remained half-hearted. Local politicians and civil servants were often closely associated with mafia-like circles themselves, benefited from their support in elections, or used their services to control the population. This created a sinister symbiosis between the state and the mafia that continued into the 20th century. The origins of the mafia in the 19th century can therefore be understood as an interplay of various factors: weak state structures, social inequality, the dominance of large landowners, the role of the forked loti, and the culture of distrust of the state. From the beginning, the mafia was more than a gang of criminals. It was a social institution that sat in the gaps of the state, exercised power through violence, and secured its position through a system of loyalty and silence. This foundation was to form the basis for the development of the mafia in the 20th century. Local protection organizations became powerful, internationally networked syndicates that had a profound influence on politics, the economy, and society. But the core remained the same: the ability to organize power in a vacuum, to enforce the silence of the community, and to build lasting structures through a mixture of fear and supposed protection.
Chapter 3: Early Structures and First Families. The emergence of the mafia in the 19th century did not take place in a clear moment, but in a long process in which loose networks of violence, protection, and economic interests gradually took on fixed structures. The local power cliques, which initially consisted of forked lots, middlemen, and armed followers, developed into the first organized groups that increasingly saw themselves as families. This designation was not meant literally, but rather an expression of an artificially created community that offered its members protection, belonging, and opportunities for advancement, but at the same time demanded unconditional loyalty. The early mafia was initially strongly anchored in rural regions. Sicily was characterized by vast estates, the latifundist system, in which large estates belonged to a few owners, while the majority of the population worked as poor tenants or day laborers. In this context, the mafia groups developed their role as mediators. They monitored the harvest, protected the transports, and ensured that agreements were kept. Anyone who wanted to lease land needed the approval of the mafia, while those who traded had to give up part of their profits. Protection and blackmail were two sides of the same coin, and the mafia managed to present itself as indispensable. Over time, different groups emerged in different regions of Sicily that controlled certain areas. These areas were called mandamenti, administrative districts in which one family was in charge. The term family pointed to a patriarchal structure. At the top was a boss, including his closest confidants, including ordinary members. Everyone had their place, and the hierarchy was strictly regulated. Within these structures, there was an unspoken law that was more important than state law, the law of omertà. Silence, loyalty, and the prohibition of bringing internal affairs to the outside world formed the glue of these early organizations. The emergence of families was also a means of ordering violence. In a society in which the state had little authority, violence was an everyday means of enforcing interests. But uncontrolled violence threatened the stability of the mafia-like structures themselves. For this reason, the families developed internal rules that regulated conflicts, contained blood feuds, and stabilized the power balance. Strict discipline applied within a family, and agreements were made between the families to avoid open wars. Although there were always bloody clashes, the organizations had an interest in not endangering their power through chaotic violence. The first families soon established themselves in the cities. Palermo, the capital of Sicily, developed into a center of the mafia in the 19th century. This is where the interests of large landowners, traders, politicians, and criminals met. The mafia controlled not only rural areas, but also trade, port activities, and urban politics. Protection rackets, contract killings, and election fraud became part of mafia-like everyday life. Politicians who relied on votes turned to the mafia to manipulate elections in exchange for protection from prosecution. This solidified a close connection between criminal structures and political power. The families saw themselves as closed communities that gave the members not only income but also status. Becoming a member was a solemn act, combined with rituals reminiscent of religious ceremonies. An oath of honor, blood, and silence bound the newcomer to the organization. Betrayal was punishable by death, and this certainty ensured that the omertà remained almost unshakable. The image of the family as a surrogate community was particularly attractive for young men from poor backgrounds who had hardly any opportunities for advancement in regular life. Within the mafia, they were able to gain recognition and power through courage, loyalty, and acts of violence. The first families also developed their own language and symbolism. Terms like honor, respect, or friend of friends were giving specific meanings. They created a code system that remained incomprehensible to outsiders and that signaled belonging. The mafia was not only a criminal organization, but also a culture that produced its own values, rituals, and traditions. This cultural dimension helped to secure the identity of the families across generations. As early as the late 19th century, these structures attracted the attention of the Italian public. Newspapers reported on mysterious connections between politicians and local rulers, on mysterious murders, and on an invisible network of influence. Intellectuals and writers began to analyze the phenomenon, and the term mafia became increasingly popular. But for a long time it remained unclear whether it was really a central organization or rather loosely connected groups. It was not until the course of the 20th century that it became clear that behind the individual families there was a system that was linked by common rules, codes, and interests. The early families had a dual role in their environment. On one hand, they were feared because they reacted with brutal violence when they were resisted. On the other hand, they also enjoyed a certain recognition in some parts of the population. They provided jobs, resolved conflicts, gave loans, and provided protection from other criminals. This ambivalent relationship between fear and dependence has shaped the image of the mafia to the present day. For many ordinary people, the path to the mafia was less a free choice than an inescapable reality in which one had to cooperate in order to survive. The emergence of the families was therefore a decisive step in the history of the mafia. Loose networks of violence and power became fixed organizations that developed their structures, rituals, and rules. These families formed the backbone of Cosa Nostra, as it was later called. They created a system that was flexible enough to serve local interests and strong enough to last for decades. This laid the foundation for the further rise of the mafia. In the coming decades, the families should continue to expand their power, internationalize their networks, and develop from local protection organizations to globally active syndicates. But the core remained, the family as a cell of power held together by loyalty, silence, and violence.
Chapter 4. The Cosa Nostra in Sicily. The Cosa Nostra is undoubtedly the best-known and most symbolic mafia organization in Italy. The term, which literally means "our cause," became in the course of the 20th century the self-designation of a criminal organization that has its roots in Sicily, and whose structures became a model for mafia-like organizations worldwide. It is considered the epitome of hierarchy, rituals, and a conspiratorial community that is deeply rooted in society, business, and politics. While the name originally became common only in the 20th century, the origins of the Cosa Nostra date back to the 19th century, when the first families were formed, based on violence, silence, and protection rackets. The Cosa Nostra developed in Sicily in a special social and political environment. For centuries, the island has been a space where foreign powers ruled without a stable state existing. The population was suspicious of any form of authority, be it the Spanish crown, the Bourbons, or, later, the Italian nation-state. This mistrust created the breeding ground for an organization that relied on self-help and parallel structures. The Cosa Nostra knew how to present itself as a kind of alternative force for order that provided security where the state failed. But security in this context always meant control and blackmail. The structure of Cosa Nostra is strictly hierarchical and at the same time decentralized. At the base are the families, each controlling a certain territory. A family is led by a capo familia, the boss who exercises authority over all members. He is responsible for the capo decina, each of which is led by 10 men. Among them are the ordinary soldiers, the soldati, who carry out the orders and are responsible for protection rackets, smuggling, contract killings, or other activities in everyday life. Above the family boss is a capo mandamento in a mandamento, who coordinates several families. The highest level is the camisone, also known as cupola, which makes overarching decisions in Sicily and regulates conflicts between families. This system emerged in the 1950s and 1960s, but its basic features were already laid out earlier. The combination of clear hierarchy, regional control, and super-regional coordination. A central feature of the Cosa Nostra is membership, which is not simply acquired by entry or birth. In order to be accepted, the aspirant goes through a ritual that symbolically marks the break with the old world and entry into the new community. Blood is spilled, an image of a saint is burned, and an oath of absolute loyalty is taken. The new uomo d'onore, the man of honor, undertakes to remain loyal to the organization beyond his life. Betrayal or breaking of silence means death. These rituals gave the Cosa Nostra an almost religious aura and strengthened the inner cohesion. From the very beginning, the Cosa Nostra knew how to secure its power not only through violence but also through influence and integration.
It interfered in politics by procuring votes, organizing election fraud, and protecting politicians. In return, she received immunity from prosecution and access to public funds. Especially after the Second World War, the Cosa Nostra succeeded in penetrating deep into the state apparatus. In Sicily, mayors, local councilors, and deputies were often elected with the support of the mafia, and the line between legal power and criminal violence became blurred. Economically, Cosa Nostra took advantage of every opportunity that presented itself. In agriculture, it controlled citrus plantations, livestock trade, and grain exports. In the cities, it dominated the construction and real estate sectors, especially during the so-called Sacco di Palermo in the 1950s and 1960s, when uncontrolled construction projects transformed the city and the mafia made billions. Later, it shifted its activities to the international drug trade, especially the heroin trade between Europe and the USA. The so-called pizza connection in the 1970s and 1980s made it clear how global Cosa Nostra was acting. A huge network for distributing drugs was built up through Italian restaurants in the United States. Despite these criminal activities, the Cosa Nostra knew how to embed itself in society. She often presented herself to the outside world as a defender of honor, tradition, and family. In poor neighborhoods, it took on tasks that the state did not fulfill. It helped with conflicts, granted small loans, or organized work. This ambivalent role as an exploiter and at the same time as a protecting power led to many people having a divided relationship with the mafia. Some loathed it, others came to terms with it, and still others saw it as an inevitable reality. Another decisive factor in the influence of the Cosa Nostra was its ability to adapt. It reacted flexibly to new opportunities, whether it was the smuggling of cigarettes, the construction of highways, or the global drug market. At the same time, it was able to adapt its structures in such a way that it stood up again even after major blows from the police and judiciary. Even if one boss was arrested, a new one moved up and the family survived. But the power of the Cosa Nostra was not unchallenged. As early as the 20th century, there were repeated attempts by the state to fight the organization. In the 1920s, Mussolini led a brutal campaign against the mafia, in which thousands of people were arrested and tortured. After the war, the Italian state was reluctant to intervene as it did not want to miss the political support of the mafia. It wasn't until the 1980s and 90s, through the courage of judges such as Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino, that the structures were seriously shaken. The major Maxi trials revealed how closely the families were connected to each other and how far their influence reached. The Cosa Nostra is therefore more than just a synonym for the mafia. It is an institution that originated in Sicily but has gained worldwide appeal. Their structure, rituals, and methods became a model for other organizations. It embodies the idea of the family as a power cell held together by silence, loyalty, and violence. Their influence extends far beyond the island, and their name is still a symbol of the phenomenon of organized crime.
Chapter 5. Camorra in Naples and Campania. While the Cosa Nostra shaped the image of the classic mafia in Sicily, a very special form of organized crime developed in Naples and the surrounding region of Campania, the Camorra. It is older than the Sicilian Mafia, less strictly hierarchically organized, and more embedded in urban life. Its origins date back to the 18th and early 19th centuries, when Naples was one of Europe's largest cities, and social antagonism, poverty, and political instability created a climate in which criminal networks could thrive. The Camorra differs from the Cosa Nostra mainly in its structure. While the Sicilian Mafia is based on clear hierarchies and a strict family organization, the Camorra was, and is, divided into many small clans that are loosely connected to each other and are often in competition. This fragmentation made the Camorra both resilient and chaotic. When a clan was smashed, new ones quickly emerged to fill the power vacuum. Violence was more commonplace and visible here than in Sicily, where the mafia often operated in secret.
The roots of the Camorra lie in the poor districts of Naples, where it initially established itself as a protective organization and mediator. It had close ties to prisons, where gangs formed that maintained their power even outside the walls. In the crowded alleys of the city, the Camorra controlled the black market, gambling, prostitution, and later smuggling. The term Camorra soon became synonymous with a criminal subculture that was firmly anchored in urban life and drew its power not least from the desperation of the poor, who depended on the help of the clans. In contrast to the Cosa Nostra, which was strongly rural for a long time, the Camorra was an urban phenomenon from the beginning. Naples, with its dense population, markets, ports, and political intrigue, provided an ideal environment for clans to flourish, extorting protection money, controlling trade, and enforcing their own laws. The proximity to politics also played a role here. As early as the 19th century, politicians used the Camorra to influence elections, suppress protests, or intimidate opponents. In return, the clans received protection and were able to conduct their business unmolested. The Camorra was characterized by a special ability to adapt. In the 20th and 30s, she suffered greatly from the repression of the fascist regime, which brutally fought her like the Mafia in Sicily. But after the Second World War, it experienced a renaissance when Naples became a center for black market activities. Cigarette smuggling, supported by close contacts with international traders, brought the clans enormous profits. Entire neighborhoods were controlled by Camorra groups that determined the everyday life of the population. A decisive change took place in the 1980s when the Camorra entered the international drug trade. In particular, the Nueva Camorra Organizzata under Raffaele Cutolo succeeded in bringing many clans together through a kind of umbrella organization and dominating the drug business. Cutolo knew how to wield power in prison and build a network that controlled the cocaine and heroin trade between South America, Naples, and Northern Europe. But his power brought rivals to the scene, and in the following years, bloody wars broke out between various Camorra groups. Thousands of people fell victim to these feuds, and Naples became one of the most violent cities in Europe. Despite this violence, the Camorra managed to penetrate deep into the legal economy. In particular, the construction and waste sectors were controlled by it. It invested in construction companies, took advantage of public contracts, often awarded by corrupt politicians, and thus made huge profits. In the waste business, the Camorra was a leader for decades, especially in the illegal disposal of toxic industrial waste, which was often buried or incinerated in Campania. This practice led to massive environmental destruction and health disasters in entire areas that became the Terra dei Fuochi, land of fires. The Camorra is also culturally different from the Cosa Nostra. While the Sicilian Mafia valued secrecy, rituals, and a united appearance, the Camorra was often less disciplined. Their clans boasted of wealth, violence was demonstratively displayed, and internal conflicts repeatedly led to chaotic conditions. This openness made the Camorra easier to attack, but its fragmentation made it difficult to fight it sustainably. Even if a boss was arrested or killed, the system remained in place because countless small clans operated independently of each other. Despite these differences from the Cosa Nostra, the Camorra had many things in common with it. Control over territories, the use of fear and silence, the connection to politics and business, and the ability to infiltrate legal structures. In some cases, Camorra clans also cooperated with the Cosa Nostra or the Ndrangheta, especially in drug trafficking. But overall, the Camorra remained an independent system that was deeply rooted in the culture and history of Naples. To this day, the Camorra is considered one of the most powerful and, at the same time, most difficult to fight mafia organizations in Italy. Its fragmentation makes it unpredictable. Its close connection to the population in the slums of Naples gives it a social base, and its adaptability ensures its survival. It is a reflection of Campania's social problems. Poverty, unemployment, corruption, and a weak state have created an environment in which the Camorra not only thrives, but is often perceived as an inevitable part of life. Thus, the Camorra is not only a chapter of Italian criminal history, but also a symptom of deep social ills. It embodies the dark side of a society in which state structures fail and criminal organizations fill these gaps. Their persistence shows how difficult it is to smash such a system when it is based not only on violence, but also on social roots.
Chapter 6. Ndrangheta in Calabria. The Ndrangheta from Calabria is today one of the most powerful, richest, and, at the same time, least tangible mafia organizations in Italy. For a long time, it was overshadowed by the Sicilian Cosa Nostra and the Neapolitan Camorra, but in recent decades, it has overtaken them in many areas and has become the central player in international organized crime. Its roots go back to the 19th century, but it was only later that it was perceived in its full dimension by the public and authorities. Calabria, the home of the Ndrangheta, is one of the poorest regions in Italy. Remote, mountainous, and dominated by agriculture, the region has long been marked by poverty, unemployment, and state neglect. These conditions provided the breeding ground for an organization based on family structures, loyalty, and the ability to help oneself. While the Cosa Nostra and the Camorra emerged more in urban contexts, the Ndrangheta developed in rural areas, in small villages and family groups that formed a closed community for generations. The central characteristic of the Ndrangheta is its strict attachment to the family in the narrower sense. While in the Cosa Nostra, the family refers more to an organizational unit, in the Ndrangheta, it is actually related by blood. The most important units, the so-called ndrine, consist almost exclusively of relatives and each control a certain territory. This close family structure makes the organization particularly resilient, as betrayal within family ties is much more severe. Silence is secured not only by fear and loyalty, but by blood ties that can hardly be broken. The hierarchy of the Ndrangheta is less centralized than that of the Cosa Nostra. Each ndrina acts relatively independently, but she is integrated into higher-level structures that enable coordination and conflict resolution. At the top is the Provincia, a body that makes strategic decisions and arbitrates disputes between the clans. But the real power remains local, which makes the organization flexible and adaptable. Traditionally, the Ndrangheta has been heavily involved in kidnappings. Especially in the 1970s, it gained sad notoriety in Italy through a wave of kidnappings in which rich entrepreneurs, politicians, or their relatives were kidnapped and released for high ransoms. This practice brought not only money to the organization, but also fear and prestige. At the same time, it established itself in agriculture, construction, and control of local markets. Protection rackets and the infiltration of local politics were also integral parts of their activities. However, the decisive rise of the Ndrangheta began with its entry into the international drug trade. From the 1980s onwards, she established close contacts with South American cartels, especially in Colombia. While Cosa Nostra came under pressure in the U.S. and the Camorra was weakened by internal wars, the Ndrangheta used its family networks and low-key structure to become the central hub for cocaine trafficking to Europe. Today, it is considered a near-monopolistic force in the European cocaine trade, with links to Spain, the Netherlands, Germany, and many other countries. Billions flow through their channels annually, and their power is based on this international business. A key factor in the success of the Ndrangheta is its ability to launder money and invest in legal industries. It invests in construction companies, gastronomy, logistics, real estate, and banks. Especially in the north of Italy, but also in Germany, Switzerland, and Canada, it has bought deep into legal markets. This expansion made it a global economic power in the shadows, whose influence extends far beyond the criminal world. In contrast to the Camorra, which is conspicuous by open violence and chaotic structures, the Ndrangheta often acts discreetly. It avoids spectacular attacks that could attract attention and instead relies on long-term influence. Violence is used when necessary, but it is targeted and hidden. For a long time, this restraint made it difficult for the authorities to grasp the dimension of their power. It was not until the 1990s when key witnesses began to testify that it became clear how profound the structures of the 'Ndrangheta are. The cultural anchoring of the 'Ndrangheta is also remarkable. She presents herself as the keeper of traditions, rituals, and her own code of honor. Admission ceremonies with religious symbols, oaths, and references to historical figures are part of their identity. This combination of crime and tradition gives it a special legitimacy in local communities. In some areas, it is not only feared but also respected because it is perceived as a guarantor of order and protection, even if this protection is based on blackmail and control. A particular problem in the fight against the 'Ndrangheta is its close connection to politics and business. In Calabria, numerous municipal councils, mayors, and entrepreneurs are demonstrably influenced by it or directly involved in its business. Electoral fraud, public procurement, and corruption are among the classic means by which it secures their power. But it was also able to exert influence beyond Calabria. Again and again, connections to national and international politicians who covered their business or profited from it were revealed. Today, the 'Ndrangheta is considered the richest mafia organization in Italy. According to estimates, it makes billions of dollars in sales every year, a significant part of which comes from drug trafficking. It is internationally networked and at the same time firmly rooted locally, a combination that makes it particularly strong. While the Cosa Nostra and the Camorra were weakened by major lawsuits, the 'Ndrangheta remained largely untouched for a long time as its structures are difficult to understand and its members are closely linked by family ties. The 'Ndrangheta is thus an example of the mafia's ability to change. From small village family groups in a poor region of southern Italy, a global player in the drug trade emerged, which at the same time remained deeply rooted in local traditions. It shows how criminal organizations can adapt to new circumstances without abandoning their cultural foundations. Their rise is also a reflection of globalization, which networks illegal businesses as well as legal markets and opens up new opportunities.
Chapter 7. Sacra Corona Unita in Puglia. The Sacra Corona Unita is the youngest of the large Italian Mafia organizations and only emerged in the 1980s in the Puglia region, the heel of the Italian boot. In contrast to the Cosa Nostra, Camorra, and Ndrangheta, whose origins date back to the 19th century, the Sacra Corona Unita developed in a modern context, characterized by proximity to international smuggling routes, the weakness of state structures in southern Italy, and the influence of already existing criminal organizations. Although it is less well known to the public, in a short time it has become a major actor in organized crime and has left a deep mark on Puglia. The origin of the Sacra Corona Unita is closely related to Puglia's particular geographical location. The region is only a few kilometers away from Albania, separated by the Adriatic Sea, which measures just about 70 kilometers at its narrowest point. This proximity made Puglia a central hub for the smuggling of cigarettes, alcohol, and later drugs and people in the 1980s. Albania, which sank into chaos after the collapse of its communist regime in the early 1990s, offered ideal conditions for criminal business organized on the Italian side by the Sacra Corona Unita. The founding itself is often attributed to one man, Giuseppe Rogoli, a criminal who, in prison, absorbed the ideas he knew from the 'Ndrangheta and the Camorra and formed a new organization in the early 1980s. He created a structure that was strongly reminiscent of the older mafia organizations in rituals and symbols, but at the same time was tailored to the special conditions of Puglia. Even the name Sacra Corona Unita, Holy United Crown, refers to a mixture of religious symbolism, tradition, and the emphasis on unity and loyalty. The organization was based on the classic mafia principles: hierarchy, silence, and unconditional loyalty.
Rituals for the admission of new members included symbolic gestures, oaths, and references to saints, which gave the act an almost sacred aura. But unlike the Cosa Nostra or the Ndrangheta, the Sacra Corona Unita was more pragmatic from the beginning. Their focus was less on deep-rooted traditions than on rapid adaptation to economic opportunities. Their first major business was cigarette smuggling. In the 1980s, illegal cigarettes from Eastern Europe and the Middle East flooded Italy, and Puglia became the central transshipment point. They were transported from Albania across the Adriatic Sea in small boats, landed in Puglia, and from there distributed throughout Italy. These deals brought enormous profits and gave the Sacra Corona Unita power and influence in a short time. Soon after, she expanded her activities to other fields. Drug trafficking became a central business area, especially the import of heroin and cocaine across the Adriatic Sea. The proximity to the Balkan states, which were shaken by civil wars in the 1990s, opened up new opportunities. Weapons from the war zones found their way to Puglia, while in return drugs and other goods were distributed through the Sacra Corona Unita. In this way, it established itself as an interface between Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and Western Europe. Human trafficking also became important for the organization. In the 1990s, it took advantage of the chaos in Albania and other parts of Eastern Europe to smuggle migrants and refugees across the Adriatic Sea to Italy. Speedboats, which transported entire groups across the sea at night, became a symbol of this time. Many of these people were exploited, used in illegal employment, or forced into prostitution. The Sacra Corona Unita benefited massively from this new form of crime. In the Puglia region itself, the organization expanded its power through classic methods: extortion of protection money, control of the construction industry, influence on municipal politics, and the infiltration of legal companies. Like the other mafia organizations, it used corruption, intimidation, and violence to secure its position. Numerous cities in Puglia were dominated by their clans, and the daily lives of many people were marked by the presence of the Sacra Corona Unita. A difference to the Cosa Nostra or the Ndrangheta is the less strict centralization. Although there is also a hierarchy and leading clans in the Sacra Corona Unita, the organization was fragmented from the beginning and characterized by internal struggles. Rivalries between different groups repeatedly led to outbreaks of violence that shook the region. This fragmentation made it weaker compared to the other mafia organizations on one hand, but also resilient on the other, since no central blow could destroy the entire structure. The role of the Sacra Corona Unita in international crime should not be underestimated despite its relative youth. It acted as a partner and mediator for other organizations, especially the Albanian Mafia, which rose sharply in the 1990s. Due to its location on the Mediterranean Sea, it became a bridge between various criminal markets. It also played a role in money laundering by investing its profits in real estate, gastronomy, and tourism in Puglia. It was not until the 1990s that the Italian authorities began to seriously combat the Sacra Corona Unita. Previously, it had often been dismissed as a regional problem that would not reach the dimension of the Cosa Nostra or the Ndrangheta. But the connection to international smuggling and the growing violence forced the state to take tougher measures. Numerous trials were conducted, many bosses were arrested, and the organization was weakened. Nevertheless, it survived and continues to adapt to new circumstances to this day. Today, the Sacra Corona Unita is not considered as powerful as the other three major organizations, but it remains an important factor in Italy's criminal landscape. Its particular strength lies in its strategic location and its ability to act as an interface between different markets. It also exemplifies how flexible mafia organizations can be when reacting to new economic and geopolitical opportunities. The Sacra Corona Unita thus embodies the latest development of the Italian Mafia, an organization that is not fed by centuries-old traditions, but by the dynamics of modern global crime. It is a product of its time and its region, marked by poverty, weak institutions, and international smuggling routes. Its rise shows that the mafia is not a relic of the past, but a phenomenon that reinvents itself again and again when conditions allow it.
Chapter 8. Mafia and Politics in 19th Century Italy. The intertwining of mafia and politics is not a phenomenon of the recent past, but goes back to the origins of the organizations in the 19th century. It was precisely in this phase, when the Italian state was only in its infancy and only loosely controlled large parts of southern Italy, that a broad field opened up for the mafia to develop power and assert its interests. The political upheavals of the time, especially Italian unification, formed the background against which the mafia consolidated its place in society and entered into the first lasting alliances with politics. When Sicily was incorporated into the newly emerging Kingdom of Italy in 1860 by the Train of 1,000 under Giuseppe Garibaldi, many people hoped for an improvement in their living conditions. The peasants expected land reforms that would break up large landholdings and open up new opportunities for them. But these hopes were disappointed. The new state largely adopted the old structures, and the large estates remained in the possession of a few families. Social inequality persisted, and the state had a weak presence in rural areas. Little changed for the peasants, except that they were now ruled by an even more distant government which sat in Turin and later in Rome. In this vacuum, the mafia was able to consolidate its role as a mediator and power factor. Local politicians who wanted to gain influence in the new Italian parliaments were dependent on support in their constituencies. This is where the mafiosi came into play, who could influence elections through their networks and their ability to intimidate. Vote buying, electoral fraud, and the intimidation of political opponents were among the methods used by the mafia to offer its services to politicians. In return, they received protection, contracts, and access to state resources. This symbiosis was beneficial for both sides. The politicians gained power, the mafia immunity and influence. This alliance was particularly close in Sicily. As early as the 1870s, newspapers reported on connections between members of parliament and local bosses. It was an open secret that many parliamentarians could only start their careers with the help of mafia-like support. The mafia itself stayed in the background, but its power grew through these political ties. It was no longer seen only as a local criminal organization, but as an actor that exerted influence at the highest level. In Campania, where the Camorra was strong, politics also played a central role. In the slums of Naples, politicians used the clans to suppress protests or exercise social control. The Camorra provided votes and violence, and the politicians in return provided protection from prosecution and access to public funds. This mutual arrangement solidified over the decades, making the mafia an integral part of political life in southern Italy. The weakness of the Italian state contributed decisively to this development. In rural areas, there was a lack of police and justice, and even when state officials were present, they could do little against the power of local networks. Many officials therefore came to terms with the mafia, or became part of its structures themselves. Corruption and clientelism permeated the administration and made it almost impossible to distinguish between state authority and mafia-like power. An example of this intertwining was the so-called Fasci del Lavoratorio uprising in Sicily in the early 1890s. This movement, which campaigned for the rights of agricultural workers and demanded a fairer distribution of land, was viewed with suspicion by the mafia. While some mafiosi initially cooperated with the farmers, most soon sided with the large landowners and the state in order to secure their own interests. Together with state repression troops, they brutally suppressed the movement, further consolidating the mafia status as a reliable partner of the ruling elite. The role of the mafia in politics was not limited to elections and uprisings. It also used its connections to gain economic advantages. Land leases, trade monopolies, public works contracts, all of this could only be secured with political support. Mafiosi who acted as middlemen between large landowners, farmers, and politicians became indispensable figures in the power structure of Sicily and southern Italy. The Italian government was well aware of the problem. Again and again, there have been investigations and debates about the role of the mafia. As early as the 1870s, members of parliament spoke openly about mafia-like structures and their connections to politics. But concrete measures failed to materialize or came to nothing, as many politicians themselves were dependent on the services of the mafia. The state proved to be unable or unwilling to take consistent action against the organizations. In the late 19th century, the state tried to crack down more harshly. Special commissions were set up, police operations were carried out, and individual mafiosi were arrested. But these measures rarely had a lasting effect. Most of the time, only minor characters were punished, while the actual bosses were protected by their political connections. In this way, the mafia has always been able to emerge stronger from the repressions. The development in the 19th century shows that the mafia was not only a criminal phenomenon from the beginning, but a political one. It knew how to secure its power not only through violence, but through alliances with politicians, civil servants, and large landowners. These connections gave her stability and made her an integral part of Italian society. At the same time, they undermined the legitimacy of the young nation-state, which never gained the same authority in southern Italy as it did in the north. This laid a pattern that was to shape the history of Italy to the present day, the close intertwining of the mafia and politics. The state tried again and again to fight the organizations, but as long as politicians benefited from their support, these efforts remained half-hearted. For the mafia, politics was not an adversary, but a partner who helped it to secure and expand its power.
Chapter 9. Fascism and the Attempt at Oppression. With the rise of Benito Mussolini and the establishment of the fascist regime in the 1920s, the relationship between the state and the mafia changed fundamentally. While in liberal Italy in the 19th and early 20th centuries, the mafia was often tolerated, even consciously involved in political processes, fascism declared it an enemy to be fought. Mussolini strove for a strong, centralized state that would not tolerate any power next to him. For him, mafia-like structures were not only a criminal problem, but also a symbol of the weakness of the Italian state. That's why he decided to openly challenge the mafia, a step that marked a deep cut in the history of the organizations. In Sicily at that time, the Cosa Nostra was deeply rooted in social and political life. It controlled land leases, trades, and parts of local politics. In many villages, the local bosses had more authority than the state representatives, and it often made more sense for the population to turn to a mafioso than to an official when they needed protection or help. Mussolini saw this as a direct competitor to his vision of an all-powerful state. Additionally, he also regarded the mafia as a symbol of the backwardness of southern Italy, which had to be overcome in the sense of fascist modernization. To fight the mafia, Mussolini sent Cesare Mori to Sicily in 1925, a prefect who soon became known as the Iron Prefect. Mori was given far-reaching powers that allowed him to take action against the mafia with extraordinary severity. He relied on a mixture of military force, intimidation, and symbolic actions. Villages were surrounded by police and military, houses were searched, suspects arrested and brought to justice. Mori was determined to break the power of the bosses and show that the fascist state was stronger than the mafia. The measures had spectacular successes in the short term. Hundreds, even thousands of suspects were arrested, entire clans were decimated, and many mafiosi fled abroad, especially to the United States. Mori staged trials that publicly discredited the power of the mafia and tried to convince the population of the superiority of the state. In some regions, it actually seemed as if the mafia had been defeated. The state presented itself as the victor, and Mussolini used this propaganda to demonstrate his strength. But Mori's methods were brutal and often arbitrary. Many innocent people were targeted by the authorities. Entire villages suffered collective punishment. The harshness of the crackdown created mistrust and resentment of the state, which did not distinguish between criminals and ordinary citizens. Although it was possible to push back the mafia in the short term, the population's trust in state institutions did not grow as a result. Rather, a climate of fear arose that left the actual social causes of the mafia untouched. After a few years, Mori was recalled by Mussolini. The dictator had realized that the complete destruction of the mafia was unrealistic and that he himself had to rely on local power structures to secure control over Sicily. In the 1930s, the regime gradually phased out the anti-mafia campaign. Many of the arrested mafiosi were released or were able to continue operating in the background. Although the mafia remained weakened, it was by no means destroyed. She adapted, held back, and waited. Another important aspect of this period was migration. Many mobsters fleeing Mori's campaign settled in the United States, especially in New York, Chicago, and other major cities. There they connected with pre-existing Italian communities and built the structures that later led to the American Cosa Nostra. In a way, the fascist campaign thus contributed to the internationalization of the mafia and to open up new opportunities for it in the New World. During the Second World War, it became clear how superficial the victory of fascism over the mafia had actually been. When the Allies landed in Sicily in 1943, they used contacts with local mafiosi to gain support and facilitate control of the island. Many bosses who had been imprisoned under Mussolini were released and regained their old power. This made it clear that the mafia had by no means disappeared, but had merely survived in secret. The episode of the fascist campaign against the mafia illustrates several fundamental aspects. First, it shows that even an authoritarian regime with massive repression was not able to permanently smash the structures of the mafia. Second, it made clear that the mafia was not a purely criminal, but a social and political phenomenon that was more deeply rooted than it could be eliminated by violence alone. Thirdly, it illustrated that the population of Sicily distrusted the state, even if it pretended to fight the mafia, because it did not understand the realities of their lives and did not solve their problems. For the mafia itself, the period under fascism meant a phase of adaptation and retreat. It lost visibility, many of its leaders fled or were arrested, but it remained underground. Its ability to adapt flexibly to changing conditions once again proved crucial for its survival. With the end of fascism and the beginning of the post-war period, it was to quickly resurface and redevelop its power.
Chapter 10, Mafia and World War II, Contacts with the Allies. The Second World War was a turning point for the Mafia, which profoundly changed its structures and enabled it to rise again. After it had apparently been weakened under fascism in the 1920s by the Iron Prefect Cesare Mori, it had largely stayed in the background in the following years. Many bosses were in prison, others had fled abroad, especially to the United States. However, when the war plunged Italy into chaos and the Allies landed in Sicily in 1943, a window opened for the Mafia that it knew how to use cleverly. Sicily played a key role in Operation Husky, the Allied invasion in July 1943. The island was the gateway to the Italian mainland and strategically of utmost importance. The Allies knew that they could only advance quickly and successfully if they could count on the support of local networks that provided them with guidance, secured supply routes, and weakened enemy forces. This is exactly where the Mafia came on the scene. In the decades before, numerous Sicilian immigrants had settled in the United States, many of them with close ties to the Cosa Nostra. Especially in New York, powerful families such as the Genovese or the Gambino family had emerged, which had gained enormous power through prohibition, gambling, and protection rackets.
This American mafia continued to maintain close contacts with Sicily. When the Allies were preparing their invasion, they resorted to these connections. Through middlemen such as Charles Lucky Luciano, one of the leading figures of the American Cosa Nostra, agreements were reached between the U.S. Military Intelligence Service and the Mafia. Luciano, who was in an American prison at the time, offered his contacts to facilitate the invasion. The cooperation was pragmatic. The Mafia helped the Allies secure the ports, especially in New York, where acts of sabotage by German agents were feared. Luciano and other bosses used their control over the dock workers to ensure smooth operations. In return, Luciano later received a pardon and was deported to Italy. But the decisive point was the connection to Sicily. Through the American Mafia, the Allies managed to make contact with influential mafiosi on the island, who offered them support during the invasion. When the Allies landed in Sicily, many villages and towns were in a state of disorientation. The fascist regime had collapsed, the state order practically no longer existed. In this power vacuum, the local mafiosi offered their services. They presented themselves as leaders who could maintain order and presented themselves to the Americans as reliable partners. Many of them were actually employed by the Allies in administrative positions. Mayor's offices, police stations, and local administrations were filled with men who had close ties to the Mafia. The Allies initially regarded this as a necessary evil in order to be able to stabilize the island quickly. But for the Mafia, it was a great opportunity, not only to regain its power, but to expand it considerably. As a result, well-known mafiosi such as Calogero Vizzini, one of Sicily's most important bosses, moved to the top of local administrations after 1943. Vizzini presented himself as an anti-fascist and supporter of the Allies, although he had previously operated underground. He took the opportunity to reorganize his network, eliminate old rivals, and establish himself as a legitimate authority. Other mafiosi followed his example. New alliances emerged all over the island, which once again deeply rooted the Mafia in society and politics. This phase marked the beginning of a close intertwining between the Mafia and the post-war order in Italy. The Allies had inadvertently contributed to the rehabilitation of the Mafia. By ascribing to it the role of a stability factor, they strengthened their position in the population. For many Sicilians, the Mafia was indeed the only tangible authority after the collapse of the fascist state. It settled conflicts, provided supplies, and restored order, but always in its own interest. The Second World War brought the Mafia not only new political opportunities, but also economic ones. Smuggling flourished, and control over food, fuel, and other scarce goods became a lucrative source of income. The post-war hardship, characterized by hunger and the black market, offered ideal conditions for criminal business. The Mafia used its networks to establish itself in these markets and further expand its power. At the same time, close ties were established between the Sicilian and American mafias. Many mafiosi who had returned from the USA brought new methods, capital, and international contacts with them. The transatlantic bridge, which had been established during the war, formed the basis for later cooperation in drug trafficking and other businesses. The American Cosa Nostra and the Sicilian Mafia formed a network that was globally oriented from the beginning. However, cooperation with the Allies also had its downsides. For many Italians, it was an open secret that the new authorities were closely linked to criminals. This undermined the credibility of the post-war order and reinforced the impression that the state was unable or unwilling to really fight the Mafia. This experience had a lasting impact on the political culture of Sicily and Italy. In retrospect, it can be said that the Second World War was a phase of rebirth for the Mafia. An organization that had been greatly weakened under fascism became a powerful force again within a few years. Through their pragmatic decisions, the Allies had inadvertently laid the foundation for the rise of the Mafia in the post-war period. Instead of finally crushing it, they made it an indispensable partner in the stabilization of Sicily. This development impressively shows how flexible and adaptable the Mafia was and is. She knew how to take advantage of political upheavals and chaotic situations. Where other structures collapsed, it filled the vacuum, offered solutions, and consolidated its power. The Second World War was not a turning point in the sense of defeat for them, but a springboard that catapulted them into the modern era.
Chapter 11. The Mafia in the Post-War Period. The years after the Second World War were a phase of resurgence and consolidation for the Mafia. The collapse of the fascist regime, the Allied occupation, and general political instability had left a power vacuum that the Mafia cleverly used to rearrange its structures and penetrate deeper into society and politics. Especially in Sicily, where the Cosa Nostra had its roots, the clans experienced a renaissance that laid the foundation for their later international importance. In the first post-war years, chaos reigned in Italy. Hunger, housing shortages, and unemployment shaped everyday life. The black market flourished, and state institutions were weak. In this environment, the Mafia once again appeared as a kind of parallel power. It controlled access to scarce goods, arranged work and protection, settled disputes, and thus presented itself to parts of the population as an indispensable authority. In fact, however, it was a system of exploitation and blackmail that unscrupulously exploited the plight of the people. Politically, the Mafia seized the opportunity to reposition itself. While in the 19th century it had often cooperated with liberal and later conservative forces, in the post-war period it sought to connect with the new political order. Particularly close relations developed with the Democrazia Cristiana, the Christian Democratic Party, which was to become the dominant force in Italy in the decades after 1945. The Mafia secured votes in elections by intimidating voters, manipulating ballot boxes, or controlling entire communities. In return, their representatives received protection from prosecution, influence on the allocation of public funds, and access to construction contracts. A key event of this period was the so-called land question in Sicily. After the war, many peasants demanded a fairer distribution of land, and left-wing movements such as the Communist Party organized land occupations. In some regions, a real social revolution seemed possible. But the Mafia opposed these movements. Although she herself often came from peasant backgrounds, she allied herself with the large landowners and conservative politicians to block land reforms. In doing so, it did not shy away from brutal violence. Trade unionists, peasant leaders, and left-wing activists were murdered in order to stifle any threat to the existing order. The most famous example is the Portella della Ginestra massacre in 1947, in which dozens of demonstrators were shot dead during a May Day rally, an event attributed to the Mafia and symbolic of its role as a bulwark against social change. This alliance between the Mafia, conservative forces, and the new Italian state was useful for both sides. The Mafia helped to keep the South politically under control and limit the influence of the Communists, which was of strategic importance in the context of the beginning of the Cold War. In return, it was able to expand its business undisturbed. During the 1950s and 1960s, it expanded its power not only in agriculture, but also in new sectors of the economy. The construction and real estate sector was particularly profitable. In Palermo, the so-called Sacco di Palermo began in the 1950s, a construction boom in which entire districts were rebuilt. The Mafia had a deep influence on the awarding of construction contracts, controlled cement plants and construction companies, and earned millions from this business. At the same time, it destroyed the historic cityscape of Palermo by demolishing old buildings to make way for cheap new buildings. Behind this process was not only greed for profit, but also the deliberate demonstration of power. The Mafia showed that it was able to change the face of an entire city according to its ideas. The Mafia also played an increasing role in international smuggling in the post-war period. Initially, it was mainly cigarette smuggling that yielded enormous profits. Later, the business shifted to drug trafficking, especially heroin.
This is where the connection to the American Cosa Nostra, which had been established during the war, paid off. Sicilian clans worked closely with their relatives and partners in the U.S. to build a transatlantic network that brought heroin from Turkey and the Middle East to the Americas via Sicily. This French connection made the Mafia a central player in the global drug trade in the 1960s and 1970s. At the same time, the Mafia remained firmly anchored in the region. Protection rackets, control of local markets, influence on politics, and connections to the church made them an omnipresent factor in southern Italian life. For many people, the Mafia was not a distant phenomenon, but part of their everyday lives. Whether you were awarded a building contract, found a job, or had a problem with neighbors, in many cases it was not the state that decided, but the local family. The Italian state reacted only hesitantly in the post-war decades. Although there have always been investigations and trials, these have often been sabotaged by corruption, political dependencies, or the silence of the population. The omerta, the vow of silence, continued to be a powerful weapon that made it difficult for the authorities to collect evidence or find witnesses. In addition, many people fear reprisals if they cooperate with the police. Thus, despite all efforts, the Mafia remained largely untouched. In the public perception, the image of the Mafia fluctuated. On the one hand, it was feared as a brutal criminal organization, but on the other hand, there was also a certain fascination with its power, wealth, and ability to establish order in a chaotic environment. In films, novels, and newspaper articles, the Mafia increasingly began to play a role that oscillated between reality and myth. This cultural dimension contributed to its perception not only as a criminal phenomenon, but also as part of Italian identity, a fatal normalization that made it difficult to combat. The post-war period was thus an era in which the Mafia redefined its power. From an organization that had been suppressed under fascism, it once again became a central player in the economy, politics, and society. It took advantage of the instability of the post-war order, the beginning of the Cold War, and the weakness of state institutions to expand its position. The alliances it forged during this period, especially with the Democrazia Cristiana and the American Cosa Nostra, laid the foundations for its international expansion in the following decades.
Chapter 12. Expansion into the north of Italy. For a long time, the Mafia was a phenomenon of the South, rooted in Sicily, Calabria, Campania, and Puglia. But from the 1960s onwards, it began to systematically expand its sphere of influence into northern Italy. This expansion was not accidental, but the result of an interplay of economic changes, migration, and the Mafia's ability to adapt its structures to new environments. While the South continued to suffer from poverty and weak institutions, the north of Italy experienced an economic miracle during this time. Industrial centers such as Milan, Turin, and Genoa attracted workers from the South, and it was precisely in this environment that the Mafia organizations found new opportunities to expand their businesses and invest capital. The large internal migration from the South to the North after the Second World War was a decisive factor. Millions of people left Sicily, Calabria, and Campania to find work in the factories of the North. With them came criminal structures that settled in the new communities. The 'Ndrangheta was particularly adept at transplanting their clans to the north. Families that had their roots in Calabria founded offshoots in Lombardy, Piedmont, and Emilia-Romagna. Since the 'Ndrangheta is strongly based on kinship, these structures could be built up almost inconspicuously. People moved with the family, opened small shops, and kept in touch with the old home villages in the background. The economic dynamism of the North offered the Mafia ideal opportunities. Construction projects, infrastructure measures, public contracts, and the growing real estate industry were fields in which Mafia-like organizations could invest capital. Through money laundering and corruption, they penetrated the construction and financial sectors. The 'Ndrangheta in particular knew how to put their profits from the drug trade into legal companies and thus secure both wealth and influence.
Soon she controlled construction companies, freight forwarders, and catering establishments, which appeared completely inconspicuous on the outside, but were in fact part of a far-reaching criminal network. The Cosa Nostra followed a similar path. In the 1970s, she invested enormous sums of money from the international heroin trade in the north. Milan became a central place where Sicilian families could launder their profits while penetrating the legal market. Banks, real estate companies, and small businesses offered ideal opportunities to conceal capital. While the authorities had their sights set on the South, the mafia spread almost unnoticed in the economically strongest part of the country. The Camorra mainly used trade to establish itself in the North. Their network in cigarette smuggling and later in drug trafficking extended far beyond Naples. In the cities of northern Italy, their clans found new markets, while at the same time establishing close contacts with foreign groups active in the port of Genoa or in Milan. The Camorra was less structured than the Ndrangheta, but its flexibility made it a major player in the new markets. The expansion of the mafia into the north had not only economic but also social consequences. In cities such as Milan or Turin, veritable parallel societies formed from southern Italian migrants, in which the mafia exercised its power. It offered work, protection, and credit, but at the same time control and exploitation. For many southern Italians trying to gain a foothold abroad, the mafia was a familiar point of reference, helping them to survive in their new environment, even if this was often associated with dependence and violence. Particularly striking was the role of the Ndrangheta, who was able to gain a foothold in northern Italy almost more than in her homeland. Cities such as Milan, Como, or Reggio Emilia became important bases of the Calabrian clans. The so-called Lombardia connection showed that the Ndrangheta was not only present in the north, but became one of the most powerful forces of organized crime there. Their discreet way of working, which was based on family structures, made it difficult to identify or smash them. Unlike the Cosa Nostra, which attracted attention for spectacular assassinations and public violence, the Ndrangheta acted largely invisibly in the north. The intertwining of the mafia and the legal economy reached a new dimension in the north. While violence and intimidation were openly visible in the south, the mafia acted as business partners in the north. It invested in restaurants, bars, construction companies, and logistics companies. Many entrepreneurs accepted these partnerships because they gave them access to capital that banks often didn't provide. At the same time, they were aware that a rejection could be dangerous. This resulted in a tacit agreement that deeply integrated the mafia into the economy. Politics was not unaffected either. With a growing presence in the north, the mafia also sought contact with local politicians there in order to secure public contracts and influence decisions. Corruption and clientelism, long seen primarily as a problem of the South, are also spreading in the wealthy regions. The myth that the North was immune to mafia-like structures was finally shattered in these years. The expansion into the North showed the adaptability of the mafia to a particular degree. It was able to vary its methods depending on the environment. In the South, it relied on open violence and control of entire communities. In the North, on investment, corruption, and covert influence. This ability made it particularly dangerous because it could adapt to the conditions of each region. In the 1980s and 1990s, it became increasingly clear that the mafia in the North was no longer just an offshoot, but a central part of the regional economy. Although the police and judiciary began to take stronger action against them, the networks were already so deeply rooted that it was hardly possible to eradicate them. The Ndrangheta in particular had become so entrenched that it is now perceived as the real mafia in many regions of northern Italy. The expansion into the north was thus a decisive step in the history of the mafia. It showed that the organizations were not limited to the South, but were able to establish themselves in any environment that offered economic opportunities. They used migration, corruption, and economic dynamism to broaden their power base, making it clear that the mafia was a national problem, not just a southern Italian one.
Chapter 13: Mafia and International Drug Routes. The rise of the Italian Mafia as a global power in the 20th century is inextricably linked to drug trafficking. While in its early history it was mainly characterized by protection rackets, control of agriculture, and local businesses, the international drug networks opened the door to an unprecedented wealth from the 1950s onwards. Heroin, and later cocaine in particular, made mafia organizations not only regional actors, but transnational players whose networks spanned continents. The first major phase began with the heroin business in the 1950s and 1960s. The starting point was the so-called French Connection, a network that sourced opium from the Middle East and Turkey, processed it in laboratories in Marseille, and then exported it to North America. The Sicilian Cosa Nostra played a key role in this. Their clans had close ties to the American Mafia families, who controlled distribution in New York, Chicago, and other cities. Sicily, with its ports and strategic location, offered ideal conditions for the transshipment of drugs. Early on, laboratories were also established on the island, in which morphine base was processed into heroin. The profits from this trade were gigantic. While protection money and construction contracts brought in millions, billions were at stake in the drug trade. A kilogram of heroin, which was bought in Turkey for a few $1,000s, could be sold in the USA for many times more. Cosa Nostra used these sums to expand its power, buy weapons, bribe politicians, and open up new business areas. At the same time, the enormous profits exacerbated rivalries within the mafia. Clans that participated in the drug business became powerful, while others stayed behind. These imbalances led to conflicts that triggered bloody mafia wars in the 1970s and 1980s. The Camorra and the Ndrangheta also soon recognized the potential of drug trafficking. The Camorra used their established smuggling routes via Naples to import drugs from North Africa and the Middle East. Later, she established close ties with South American cartels, especially in the cocaine trade. Its loose structure with many small clans proved to be an advantage because it was able to act flexibly and adapt quickly to new markets. While some clans smuggled cannabis and heroin, others specialized in cocaine. The decisive rise of the Ndrangheta began in the 1980s when it established close contacts with the Colombian cartels. Calabrian families, who traditionally had strong networks to North and South America through migration, took on the role of intermediaries between South America and Europe. They organized the transport of cocaine via cargo ships, yachts, and even submarines that brought the cargoes across the Atlantic. In Rotterdam, Antwerp, and Genoa, they had close contacts with dock workers and customs officers who allowed the drugs to pass unnoticed. Today, the Ndrangheta is considered an almost monopolistic force in the European cocaine trade. The drug routes were diverse and changed depending on the political situation and repression. Heroin reached Europe from Afghanistan, Pakistan, and the Middle East via Turkey and the Balkans. Cocaine came from Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia, mostly via West Africa or directly via the major ports of Europe. Cannabis was imported from Morocco via Spain and Italy. In all these flows, Italian Mafia organizations played a key role, whether as transporters, middlemen, or large distributors. The control of the drug routes brought not only wealth, but also international alliances. The Mafia worked closely with cartels from Colombia and Mexico, cooperated with Albanian, Serbian, and Turkish groups, and established links with Asia. The Ndrangheta in particular knew how to build trust with partners through its family structures. While other organizations suffered from mistrusts and betrayals, the Ndrangheta was considered a reliable partner because its clan structure made betrayal almost impossible. With the drugs came new forms of money laundering. The gigantic sums had to be fed into the legal economic cycle without attracting the attention of the authorities. This showed the Mafia's adaptability. It invested in building companies, real estate, restaurants, hotels, and banks. Especially in northern Italy, but also in Germany, Switzerland, and Spain, Mafia clans bought land, companies, and luxury goods. Thus, drug money flowed into legal structures and strengthened the intertwining of organized crime and the official economy. But drug trafficking also brought violence on a previously unknown scale.
In the 1970s and 1980s, the Great Mafia Wars raged in Sicily, in which rival clans fought over the control of the heroin routes. Hundreds of people fell victim to these conflicts, including not only mafiosi, but also judges, prosecutors, police officers, and uninvolved civilians. The assassination attempts at Giovanni Falcone and Falcone Borsellino in 1992, both of whom were central figures in the fight against the drug trade, marked the peak of this violence. In Calabria, bloody feuds also occurred when clans of the Ndrangheta fought for the supremacy in the cocaine trade. The international dimension made the fight against the mafia even more difficult. National borders do not play a role in the drug routes. Italian clans operated in South America, Africa, the USA, and all over Europe. Investigators had to work with authorities in different countries, which often had different interests and legal basis. The mafia cleverly exploited this fragmentation and built transnational networks that were largely immune to local police measures. To this day, drug trafficking is the most important source of income for the Italian mafia. It has raised her power to a new level and enabled her to penetrate all areas of business and politics. At the same time, it has increased violence and internationalized mafia-like structures. Control over the drug routes is key to understanding the modern mafia. Without it, it would have remained a regional phenomenon. With them, it became a global player.
Chapter 14: Violence, Assassinations, and the Bloody Decade of the 1970s-80s. The 1970s and 1980s marked one of the bloodiest periods in the history of the Italian Mafia. It was a time in which the organizations not only achieved gigantic power through their criminal business, but also became the center of public attention through open violence and spectacular assassinations. In Sicily, in particular, the conflicts within the Cosa Nostra escalated into a veritable war that claimed hundreds of lives and fundamentally changed the relationship between the state and the mafia. However, violence also increased dramatically in Campania and Calabria during this period, as Camorra and Ndrangheta fought for control of new markets. The background to this escalation was mainly in the drug business. In the 1970s, the heroin trade had flushed billions of dollars into the coffers of the mafia. Clans involved in this business rose rapidly, while others fell behind. Especially in Sicily, this led to massive tensions within the Cosa Nostra. For a long time, the traditional power lay with the Palermitan families, who controlled the business. But in the 1970s, new forces emerged, most notably the Corleonesi, led by Salvatore Toto Riina and Bernardo Provenzano. This group was known for its brutality and ruthlessness. It wanted supremacy over the entire Cosa Nostra and was prepared to use any means to achieve this. A bloody internal war began. The Corleonesi systematically eliminated their rivals, killed old bosses and their families, and did not shy away from murdering allies if they were not absolutely loyal. Palermo became the scene of a series of murders that shook public life. Politicians, lawyers, journalists, and even police officers fell victim to the violence. The number of victims rose into the hundreds, and entire power structures were wiped out within a few years. The rise of the Corleonesi marked the beginning of a new, particularly violent era of the mafia. But the violence was not only directed internally, but also externally. The Cosa Nostra began to systematically target representatives of the state. In the 1970s and 80s, numerous judges, prosecutors, and investigators were murdered who had dared to take action against the mafia. Names such as Cesare Terranova, Pio La Torre, and Carlo Alberto Dalla Chiesa stand for a generation of courageous personalities who fell victim to the terror of the mafia. The attacks were often spectacular and served not only to eliminate individuals, but also to demonstrate power. A particularly drastic event was the murder of General Carlo Alberto Dalla Chiesa in 1982. Dalla Chiesa had been sent to Palermo to coordinate the fight against the mafia as prefect. He had previously fought the left-wing terrorist group of the Red Brigades with great success in the 1970s and was considered one of Italy's most capable security strategists. But after only a few months in Palermo, he and his wife were shot dead by the Mafia on the street. This murder sparked nationwide outrage and made it clear how far the Mafia was willing to go to defend its power. The Camorra in Naples was also marked by bloody clashes in the 1980s. Under the leadership of Raffaele Catullo, the boss of the Nuova Camorra Organizzata, a new generation of clans tried to gain supremacy. Catullo built up an almost feudal system in which he united hundreds of small clans under his authority. But this system was unstable, and brutal feuds with rival groups soon broke out. Naples experienced a wave of violence that terrified entire neighborhoods. Hundreds of murders, including many innocent victims, made the 1980s a time of open war in the streets. Violence also escalated in Calabria. The Ndrangheta had risen in the international cocaine trade and used its profits to expand its power. But the rivalry between different ndrine led to a series of bloody feuds that were particularly intense in the 1980s and early 1990s. Entire villages were drawn into the conflict, and the number of deaths rose year after year. Unlike in Sicily or Naples, the violence in Calabria often remained local in nature, but its brutality was in no way inferior to that of other regions. The violence of these years had several consequences. On the one hand, it made the Mafia more visible than ever before. The assassinations of judges, politicians, and high officials brought the issue into the headlines and forced the Italian public to deal with reality. On the other hand, they triggered a counter-movement. Society began to protest more strongly against the Mafia. Citizens' initiatives, trade unions, and particularly courageous individuals openly opposed the rule of the clans. Within the state, too, the determination to crack down grew. The bloody decades of the 1970s and 80s finally led to the major anti-mafia trials, which reached their peak in the late 1980s. Without the extreme violence and attacks that shook the country, this process of mobilization would probably not have been possible. The price was high. Hundreds of people lost their lives, entire regions were covered by terror, and trust in the state was shaken. But the escalation also made it clear that the Mafia was not untouchable. In retrospect, the 1970s and 80s appeared to be a kind of turning point. Through drug trafficking and its international networking, the Mafia achieved an abundance of power like never before. At the same time, it crossed a line by openly challenging the state. The assassinations and massacres of this time laid the foundation for a new era of confrontation, which led to spectacular trials and a strengthening of the anti-mafia movement in the 1990s. But in the dark years before, it often seemed as if the Mafia had a firm grip on the country, and the number of victims made it clear what price Italy had to pay for decades of tolerance toward the clans.
Chapter 15: The Great Anti-Mafia Trials. The escalation of violence in the 1970s and 1980s had plunged Italy into a deep crisis. The Mafia seemed untouchable. It murdered judges, prosecutors, and politicians, dominated entire regions, and earned billions in the international drug trade. But it was precisely this brutality that led the state to finally turn against them with renewed determination. The turning point came in the 1980s with the major anti-mafia trials, which represented a decisive blow against Cosa Nostra and its allies, not only legally but also symbolically. The basis for these trials was the work of a small group of judges and prosecutors who came together in Palermo and became known as the Pool Anti-Mafia. Among the most important figures were Giovanni Falcone, Paolo Borsellino, Rocco Cinici, and later Antonino Caponetto. They realized that the Mafia could not be fought by isolated investigations into individual crimes, but only by a comprehensive strategy that targeted its entire structure. Instead of concentrating on individual perpetrators, they wanted to attack the organization as a whole.
A decisive breakthrough was achieved through the testimony of key witnesses, so-called pentiti. The vow of silence of the omertà had been the most important protective shield of the mafia for decades. But in the early 1980s, some high-ranking mafiosis began to cooperate with the judiciary. The most famous was Tommaso Buscetta, a member of Cosa Nostra who fled abroad after an internal war between the clans and was eventually arrested in Brazil. Buscetta decided to talk to Falcone and expose the internal structure of the mafia like no one before. He explained the hierarchy, the role of families, the function of the cupola, the commission that made strategic decisions, and described the mechanisms of violence, extortion, and international drug trafficking. His statements were a sensation and formed the basis for the following trials. The most famous of these proceedings was the so-called Maxi trial in Palermo, which began in 1986 and lasted until 1992. It was the largest criminal trial against the mafia in the history of Italy. More than 400 defendants had to answer for their actions, including some of Sicily's most powerful bosses. The trial took place in a purpose-built high-security courtroom which acted like a fortress to ensure the safety of the judges and witnesses. Hundreds of lawyers, police officers, and journalists were involved, and the world public followed the proceedings with great interest. The charges included murder, drug trafficking, protection rackets, membership in a criminal organization, and numerous other crimes. The evidence was based not only on the testimony of Buscetta and other pentiti, but also on extensive investigations documenting the extent of Cosa Nostra's power. For the first time, the mafia was recognized as a unified organization and treated legally, not just as a collection of individual criminals. The verdict of the Maxi trial in December 1987 was a historic milestone. More than 300 defendants were sentenced to prison terms, some of them decades, including several bosses for life. The judiciary had dealt the mafia a blow that had never been done before. The message was clear. The organization was not sacrosanct. The state could hit it if it acted with determination and unity. But the fight was not decided. Many sentences were weakened or overturned on appeal, and the mafia responded with even more violence. In the early 1990s, it retaliated with a series of assassinations that shook the country. In particular, the murders of Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino in 1992 marked a tragic climax. Falcone was killed in a car bomb attack on the highway to Palermo, along with his wife and bodyguards. Only a few weeks later, Borsellino also fell victim to a bomb in Palermo. These attacks were not only attacks on individuals, but on the entire state and society. The reaction of the Italian population was tremendous. Millions of people took to the streets to protest against the mafia. Schools, universities, and citizens' initiatives organized demonstrations. And in Palermo itself, a strong anti-mafia movement emerged that openly opposed the clans. For the first time in decades, many people dared to speak publicly about the mafia and question its rule. The state reacted with new laws, tougher penalties, and increased cooperation between the police, the judiciary, and international authorities. In addition to the Maxi trial in Sicily, there were also important proceedings in other regions. In Naples, large parts of the Camorra structures were exposed, and in Calabria, the judiciary began to target the Ndrangheta. But while Cosa Nostra was significantly weakened by the trials and the wave of violence of the early 1990s, Camorra and Ndrangheta proved to be more adaptable. The Ndrangheta in particular took advantage of the power vacuum to further expand its control over the international cocaine trade. Nevertheless, the major anti-mafia trials were a decisive step. They proved that the mafia was not insurmountable, and they created a new consciousness in Italian society. The state showed that it was able to defend itself if it acted with determination and unity. At the same time, the trials made it clear how dangerous and powerful the mafia still was and what price those who opposed it had to pay. In retrospect, the 1980s and early 1990s are a time of confrontation in which the mafia and the state were at open war. The judiciary achieved unprecedented successes, but the number of victims was high, and many courageous personalities lost their lives. The Maxi trial remains a symbol of this era, a testament to the courage of those who opposed the mafia and a memorial to the violence that these organizations were able to unleash when their power was threatened.
Chapter 16: Falcone, Borsellino, and the Fight Against the Cosa Nostra. The fight against the mafia in Italy is inextricably linked with the names Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino. The two Sicilian judges became symbolic figures for the resistance against Cosa Nostra, and their commitment, their methods, and finally their deaths in 1992 shaped the relationship between the state and organized crime like hardly any other event. They embodied a new generation of lawyers who did not allow themselves to be paralyzed by fear, but sought to smash the structures of the mafia with scientific precision and courageous commitment. Giovanni Falcone was born in 1939 in Palermo, a city that was shaped by the mafia like no other. He came from a humble background and grew up in an environment where the presence of the Cosa Nostra was omnipresent. After studying law, he joined the judicial service and soon began to specialize in organized crime. What distinguished him from many others was his sober, almost technocratic approach. Falcone saw the mafia not only as a cultural or social phenomenon, but as an organization that functioned according to economic and organizational principles. His goal was to see through this structure and make it legally vulnerable through meticulous work. Paolo Borsellino, also born in Palermo in 1940, was a close friend and later companion of Falcone. He too was deeply embedded in Sicilian society and knew the reality of the mafia at close quarters. His legal career also led him to deal with organized crime, and he shared Falcone's conviction that only a systematic, collective strategy could succeed. Together, they formed the core of the Pool Anti-Mafia, a group of judges and prosecutors formed in Palermo in the 1980s under the leadership of Rocco Cinici and later Antonino Caponetto. Falcone and Borsellino realized early on that the previous fight against the mafia had failed because it was fragmented. Individual judges investigated in isolation, often without adequate protection, and were easily victims of intimidation or assassinations. The Anti-Mafia pool radically changed this system. All investigations were shared, information was collected centrally, and decisions were made together. This prevented the murder of a single judge from bringing entire investigations to a standstill. This model proved to be decisive for the later successes. Another breakthrough was Falcone's work with the pentiti, the key witnesses. The most important among them was Tommaso Buscetta, who began to testify extensively about the structures of Cosa Nostra in the 1980s. Falcone knew how not to treat Buscetta's statements as mere stories, but to insert them like pieces of a puzzle into a systematic overall picture. He combined the statements with financial data, communication patterns, and international investigations to portray the mafia as a company that functioned according to clear rules. This approach made it possible for the first time to prosecute Cosa Nostra as a whole organization. The culmination of this work was the Maxi trial in Palermo from 1986 to 1992, in which Falcone and Borsellino played central roles. The trial was a logistical and legal masterpiece that was only made possible by the cooperation of the pool and the testimony of the key witnesses. More than 300 mafiosi were sentenced to prison terms, some of them long, and the existence of a central leadership structure, the cupola, was confirmed by the courts. For the mafia, this was a blow of historic importance. For the state, proof that organized crime was not invincible. But the successes made Falcone and Borsellino targets. Within the mafia, especially among the Corleones around Salvatore Toto Riina, the decision to kill the two judges matured. They were considered the most dangerous opponents because they threatened not only individual mafiosi, but the entire organization.
In addition, Falcone increasingly coordinated international investigations, for example with the USA in the fight against drug trafficking. In doing so, he directly attacked the transnational interests of the Mafia. On May 23, 1992, Falcone, together with his wife Francesca Morvillo and 3 bodyguards, was murdered by a huge explosive explosion on the highway from Palermo to Capaci. The Mafia had deposited hundreds of kilograms of TNT under the roadway and triggered the explosion when Falcone's car drove by. The attack was a shock for the whole of Italy and the world. It was not just a murder, but a symbolic attack on the state itself. Only 57 days later, on July 19, 1992, Paolo Borsellino was also murdered. A car bomb exploded in Via D'Amelio in Palermo while he was visiting his mother. 5 of his bodyguards died with him. The assassination was the continuation of the terror with which the Mafia wanted to bring the state to its knees. But instead of sowing fear, the murders triggered an unprecedented wave of outrage. Millions of Italians took to the streets to demonstrate. Schools, universities, and associations founded anti-mafia initiatives, and the call for more decisive action against Cosa Nostra became unmistakable. The government responded with a series of emergency laws that intensified the fight against the Mafia. New investigative tools had been introduced, leniency programs have been improved, and law enforcement has been broadened. Hundreds of mafiosi were arrested, including Salvatore Riina, who was arrested in 1993 after decades of going into hiding. Falcone's and Borsellino's deaths were not in vain. They had forced the state to act seriously through their sacrifice. Her legacy lives on to this day. In Italy, they are considered heroes whose courage and integrity have become a symbol of resistance against the Mafia. Schools, streets, and squares bear their names. Their stories are told in films, books, and commemorations. Their example inspired generations of lawyers, police officers, and citizens who dedicated themselves to the fight against the Mafia. Falcone and Borsellino showed that the Mafia is not omnipotent, that it can be fought with courage, solidarity, and systematic work. But her death is also a reminder of the price of this fight. They became martyrs in a conflict that still shapes Italy today. Their work was proof that the state can win if it acts with unity and determination, and their murder was a reminder that victim is never final as long as the structures of the Mafia continue to exist.
Chapter 17: Economic Structures: Construction, Banking, Money Laundering. The power of the Italian Mafia is not based solely on violence, intimidation, and secret rituals, but to a large extent on its ability to infiltrate and exploit economic structures. Without this economic base, it would never have become the global organization it is today. In particular, construction, banking, and money laundering are the pillars of their economic success. These areas allow the various mafia organizations to launder illegal profits, influence entire industries, and anchor their power in society. Construction has played a central role from the very beginning. As early as the 1950s, during post-war reconstruction, the mafia discovered the possibilities offered by public construction projects. In Palermo in particular, there was an unprecedented building boom, which became known as the Sacco di Palermo. Entire neighborhoods were torn down to make way for modern apartment blocks. The Mafia controlled construction companies, supplied cement and other materials, and used corruption and intimidation to ensure that their companies were given preferential treatment. Politicians involved in awarding the contracts worked hand in hand with the bosses. In this way, a large part of the public money that was actually intended for reconstruction and modernization flowed directly into the coffers of Cosa Nostra. This mechanism was repeated in many regions of Italy. Whether road construction, bridges, schools, or hospitals, the Mafia knew how to attract contracts. It often found its straw companies that were officially independent but were in fact controlled by it. These companies offered seemingly low prices, made possible by cheap labor and low-quality materials. This allowed them to eliminate the competition while making huge profits. This had devastating consequences for the population. Many buildings were of poor quality, collapsed, or had to be renovated after a few years. But the Mafia did not care about sustainability. Their sole goal was quick profit. Banking was also central to the Mafia. Illegal profits from protection money, smuggling, and drug trafficking had to be fed into legal channels. The Mafia recognized early on that banks were ideal partners, sometimes out of naivety, often out of deliberate cooperation. In the 1970s and 80s, when the sums from the heroin trade exploded, Cosa Nostra began to launder large parts of its money through banks in Switzerland, Luxembourg, or Liechtenstein. These countries offered discretion, weak controls, and banking secrecy that were perfect for criminal funds. But Italian banks themselves were also involved. A notorious example is Banco Ambrosiano, which was involved in a gigantic financial scandal in the 1980s. Connections to the Vatican, the Mafia, and political circles made the case a symbol of the entanglement of the legal and illegal worlds. The Mafia used such banks to invest their profits from drug trafficking in real estate, industry, and international financial transactions. In doing so, it gained not only wealth but also political influence, because those who had money could buy politicians, civil servants, and entrepreneurs. Money laundering was and is at the heart of the Mafia's economic power. Without them, the billions from drugs, extortion, and smuggling would be useless because they could not be used legally. Over the decades, the Mafia developed increasingly sophisticated methods. Investments in restaurants, bars, hotels, or transport companies were classic. These industries are cash-intensive, so illegal income could easily be declared as legal sales. Later, real estate was added. The purchase of land, apartments, and commercial space offered not only a way to launder money, but also to make capital gains through appreciation. The Ndrangheta in particular perfected money laundering. Due to its dominance in the cocaine trade, it had enormous sums at its disposal, which it systematically invested in legal industries. In northern Italy, it invested in construction companies, freight forwarders, and the food industry. In Germany, she bought restaurants, pizzerias, and ice cream parlors that served not only as money laundering machines, but also as meeting places for her clans. In Switzerland, Canada, and Australia, billions flowed into real estate and banks. The Ndrangheta showed that modern mafia organizations are no longer just regional actors, but part of the global financial system. A particularly sophisticated mechanism was the use of letterbox companies and offshore accounts. Funds could be moved and concealed via companies in Panama, the Cayman Islands, or Cyprus without their origin being visible. Lawyers, notaries, and financial advisors often worked with the Mafia, sometimes consciously, partly out of indifference or greed for profit. These helpers were crucial in feeding the criminal profits into the legal economic cycle. The economic structures made the Mafia not only rich, but also difficult to attack. While violence was visible and punishable, the Mafia often moved in gray areas in the world of finance. Many of their investments were formally legal, even if the capital came from crime. This allowed it to gain control over entire sectors of the economy and present themselves as a respectable actor at the same time. Entrepreneurs who needed loans took money from the Mafia. Politicians who had to finance campaigns accepted their donations. In this way, a network of dependencies grew that reached far beyond the classic Mafia strongholds. The combination of construction, banking, and money laundering made it clear that the Mafia was not a primitive gang of criminals, but a highly developed economic power. Their bosses knew how to analyze markets, make investments, and link legal and illegal businesses. In doing so, it represented a competition for legal capitalism, a competition that had an advantage through violence, corruption, and secrecy. But it is precisely these structures that also offer targets for attack. Investigators began systematically tracking financial flows in the 1990s and 2000s. Instead of directly confronting mafiosi on the street, they tried to block their sources of money. New laws against money laundering, international agreements, and the work of specialized financial investigators made it difficult for the Mafia to do business. Nevertheless, she remains a master at exploiting loopholes and opening up new paths to this day. The economic foundation of the mafia is the key to its survival. Violence may secure power in the short term, but in the long run, it is construction, banking, and money laundering that make its existence possible. As long as the clans can invest billions, they will continue to exert influence, not only in the shadows, but in the middle of the legal world.
Chapter 18. Mafia Abroad, USA, Germany, and Worldwide. The mafia has never been just a local or national phenomenon. From the very beginning, it was characterized by migration, trade, and international networks. As early as the 19th century, hundreds of thousands of Italians emigrated to North and South America, France, Belgium, and Germany, and with them, the structures of the mafia also spread. It was part of the Italian diaspora and developed into a global network in the new countries, linking illegal business with legal markets. Today, its influence extends from New York to Melbourne, from Toronto to Buenos Aires, and its connections make it one of the most powerful transnational organizations in the world. The expansion into the United States was particularly formative. In the late 1800s, millions of Italian migrants arrived in America, many from Sicily, Calabria, and Campania. In the poor neighborhoods of New York, Chicago, or New Orleans, communities were formed in which the mafia established its first bases. First, they controlled small protection rackets, gambling, and prostitution. But with prohibition in the 1920s, everything changed. The prohibition of alcohol opened up gigantic business opportunities, and the American Cosa Nostra rose to become one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the world. Figures such as Al Capone, Lucky Luciano, or Vitor Genovese became legends whose names are still associated with the mafia today. It was Luciano who introduced the commission system in the 1930s, a kind of governing body that coordinated the various families in New York and settled conflicts. This structure was strongly inspired by the Sicilian Cosa Nostra, but it developed independently and adapted to American conditions. The American mafia controlled gambling, construction, trade unions, and drug trafficking for decades. It was so closely intertwined with politics and the economy that it was perceived not only as a criminal organization, but as a state within the state. The connection between the American and Italian mafias has always remained close. They cooperate intensively, especially in drug trafficking. Sicily served as a hub for heroin, which reached the USA via the French connection from Turkey and Marseille. The American Cosa Nostra took over the distribution, while the Sicilian clans organized production and transport. Later in the cocaine trade, it was mainly the Calabrian Ndrangheta clans who maintained close contacts with the cartels in South America and brought the substance to the USA via Europe. But the mafia was not limited to North America. It also played an early role in South America. Italian migrants founded communities in Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay, in which mafia-like structures gained a foothold. Especially in Argentina, the clans found a fertile environment. Political instability, corruption, and flourishing trade routes made the country an ideal base. Italian families also established close contacts in Venezuela and Colombia, especially in drug production. They helped build logistical networks that brought cocaine to Europe and North America. In Europe, the mafia also spread widely. Germany had been an important destination since the 1960s, when many Italians came to the Federal Republic as guest workers. With them came the clans. The 'Ndrangheta in particular used this migration to settle permanently in regions such as North Rhine-Westphalia, Baden-Württemberg, and Bavaria. Restaurants, pizzerias, and ice cream parlors became front companies and meeting places, while drug trafficking and money laundering were organized in the background. Germany became a central logistics center for the cocaine trade in Europe. The Duisburg crime of 2007, when 6 members of an Ndrangheta clan were shot dead front of a pizzeria, made the presence of the Calabrian Mafia in Germany dramatically visible. Switzerland also played an important role. Through its banks, which for a long time guaranteed strict banking secrecy, it offered ideal conditions for money laundering. Many clans used Swiss accounts to park their billions from drug and smuggling deals. At the same time, they invested in real estate and companies in Switzerland and thus gained influence in the local economy. In Canada, especially in Toronto and Montreal, a strong mafia presence also developed. Sicilian and Calabrian families built structures there in the 20th century that were closely linked to the clans in Italy. In Australia, where many Italians found a new home after the war, the Ndrangheta clans also founded offshoots that played an important role in the cocaine and heroin trade. Today, Australia is considered one of the most important centers of the Calabrian Mafia outside Europe. The global spread of the Mafia shows that it has been able to adapt perfectly to the conditions of migration and globalization. While other criminal organizations remained local or national, the Mafia used family ties, cultural proximity, and economic opportunities to build a transnational network. Its members were able to move abroad in Italian communities without attracting attention while maintaining close ties to their homeland. The international dimension made the fight against the Mafia particularly difficult. National police authorities quickly reached their limits, as they often did not have the necessary structures for international cooperation. It is only in recent decades that Europol, Interpol, and bilateral agreements have created more effective mechanisms to take action against the Mafia's global networks. But the clans were often one step ahead of the authorities. They used offshore accounts, shell companies, and complex corporate networks to conceal their funds. And they changed routes as soon as pressure on a route became too great. The Mafia abroad is not just an appendage of the Italian organizations, but an integral part of the global system. Without its connections to North and South America, Germany and Australia and other countries, it would never have become what it is today, a global player with billions in sales. Its ability to be locally rooted and internationally networked at the same time makes it unique and explains why it still exists despite decades of fighting.
Chapter 19. Modern Developments and New Business Models. Throughout its history, the Mafia has proven time and again that it can adapt to new social, economic, and political conditions. In the present, this ability to change is more evident than ever. While on the one hand, it continues to be protection racketeers, smugglers, and drug traffickers in its traditional strongholds, on the other hand, it has developed new business models that firmly anchor it in the modern globalized world. From renewable energy to digital crime, from waste management to food production, the Mafia has greatly diversified its portfolio, proving that it is by no means a relic of the past, but a highly flexible entrepreneurial organization. One of the central areas of recent decades has been waste management. As early as the 1980s, the Camorra clans in particular discovered that the disposal of industrial and hazardous waste promised enormous profits. Companies from northern Italy, which had to pay high costs for the legal disposal of hazardous waste, found a cheap, albeit illegal partner in the Camorra. Toxic waste was illegally buried in fields, disposed of in abandoned quarries or dumped into the sea. Entire areas of Campania, which later became known as the Terra di Fulci, were contaminated in this way. The price for this is still paid by the inhabitants, who have to live with increased cancer rates and contaminated soil. For the Camorra, however, this business was a cash cow that brought in billions. The 'Ndrangheta and the Cosa Nostra also soon recognized the potential of waste management. They used their contacts in the construction and waste disposal industry to gain a foothold in this area as well. Once again, the pattern emerged. Through corruption, intimidation, and control over public contracts, they secured access to lucrative contracts. Garbage was not only disposed of cheaply, but sometimes also exported illegally, for example to Africa or Eastern Europe. The Mafia operated here like a multinational corporation, cutting costs and maximizing profits, except that the consequences for the environment and people were catastrophic. Another area in which the Mafia has gained a foothold in recent decades is the energy industry. Especially in the field of renewable energies, such as wind and solar farms, the clans discovered a new source of money. Billions have been invested in the expansion of renewable energies through subsidies from the European Union and the Italian state. The Mafia knew how to grab these funds through straw films, falsified tenders, and corruption. Entire wind farms in Sicily and Calabria were controlled by Mafia-like clans that remained inconspicuous via middlemen and fake corporate structures. This showed how flexibly the organization could react to new political priorities. Where the state invested, the Mafia was immediately on hand to get a piece of the cake. Food production and distribution were also increasingly infiltrated by the Mafia. Italian products such as olive oil, wine, mozzarella, or pasta enjoy an excellent reputation worldwide, and this is exactly where the Mafia came in. It participated in production, falsified quality labels, and exported inferior or even harmful products as made in Italy. At the same time, it controlled the distribution in supermarkets and markets, both in Italy and abroad. The so-called agro-mafia system brings in billions every year and shows how deeply the Mafia has penetrated the legal economy. It is often impossible for consumers to tell whether a product actually comes from a clean production chain or whether it is part of Mafia-like structures. One field that has become increasingly important in recent years is digital crime. Here, too, the Mafia is adapting to the circumstances of the time. Money laundering today takes place not only via real estate or restaurants, but also via cryptocurrencies and online transactions. The clans use digital platforms to conceal money flows and organize international business. At the same time, they're making inroads into the realm of online gambling. Many illegal betting portals are operated by Mafia organizations that not only earn money with them, but also have perfect opportunities for money laundering. The internet offers them new spaces in which they can act less visibly and at the same time act globally. Another modern business model is the exploitation of refugee flows and migration. In recent years, various clans have used their contacts to earn money from the smuggling networks that bring people from Africa and the Middle East to Europe. From the organization of transports to the exploitation of migrants' labor and agriculture, for example in Calabria, when harvesting oranges or tomatoes, the Mafia profits at the expense of the weakest. These workers are often kept in slave-like conditions, while the Mafia earns millions from the export of the products. The Corona pandemic brought another opportunity, which the Mafia used unscrupulously. While many companies got into trouble, the clans offered loans, quickly, unbureaucratically, but with high interest rates and the price of dependency. At the same time, they infiltrated the healthcare sector and supply chains of medical supplies. The state aid money was also a target. Through front companies and falsified documents, clans secured funds that were actually intended for ailing companies. All these developments show that the Mafia today is less conspicuous by open violence than by its ability to act like a modern business group. It analyzes markets, identifies opportunities, and invests where the state or society has weaknesses. However, it always remains a criminal organization that secures its position through corruption, extortion, and intimidation. So the modern Mafia is not a simple repetition of the old pattern of pistol murders and protection money letters. It is a highly adapted, globally networked, and economically oriented organization that has long since become part of the legal economy. This makes it particularly dangerous because it is no longer as easily recognizable as it used to be. A clan that operates a wind farm or controls an organic food company may not seem like a crime syndicate at first glance, and yet it is part of the same system that has practiced violence, corruption, and exploitation since the 19th century. The new business models also make it clear that the Mafia never stands still. It follows the money and flows of globalization. It uses political trends, economic crises, and technological developments to expand its power. And as long as it has this ability to adapt, it will continue to exist in the modern world, no longer as a relic of the past, but as a shadow force that operates with the instruments of the 21st century.
Chapter 20. Aftermath, Culture, and the Image of the Mafia in the Media and Society. The Mafia is not only a criminal organization that earns billions through violence, drug trafficking, and money laundering. It is also a cultural phenomenon that has left deep traces in Italian society and far beyond. Its aftermath is visible in politics, in the economy, in the social fabric, and, last but not least, in culture and the media. The image of the Mafia is characterized by fear, fascination, myths, and cliches, an ambivalent mixture that still determines perception today. In Italy itself, the Mafia remains an everyday factor. Even though the major trials and the mobilization of society since the 1980s and 1990s have brought significant progress, the clans are still present. In many regions, the Mafia is deeply involved in local politics, controls parts of the economy, and influences social life. Especially in southern Italy, despite all the efforts of the state, it is a power factor that no one can ignore. At the same time, the decades-long presence of the Mafia has left its mark on the collective consciousness. Many people live with a distrust of state institutions because they have experienced that they were often weaker or more corrupt than the organizations they were supposed to be fighting against. The cultural dimension of the Mafia is closely linked to this everyday experience. In many regions, codes, rituals, and values exist that are officially rejected but still have a subliminal effect. The vow of silence of the omertà, for example, is not only a rule within the Mafia, but has also shaped parts of society that have learned to remain silent rather than oppose the clans. The normalization of violence and corruption is one of the most dangerous aftermaths because it is deeply rooted in thought and action. At the same time, the Mafia has found its way into literature, film, and pop culture like hardly any other criminal organization. As early as the 1930s and 40s, she appeared in novels and reportages, but her great international fame came through the cinema. Films such as The Godfather by Francis Ford Coppola shaped an image of the Mafia that continues to have an impact today, a mixture of archaic honor, family ties, power, and violence. The Godfather stylized the Mafia into a kind of tragic family story that is almost more reminiscent of an ancient drama than a criminal reality. Millions of viewers worldwide saw not primarily murderers and blackmailers, but men who struggled for loyalty, tradition, and power. This portrayal had ambivalent consequences. On the one hand, it drew attention to the Mafia and made it a global topic of conversation. On the other hand, it glorified reality and contributed to romanticizing the Mafia. Many young people, especially outside Italy, began to see mafiosis as heroes or at least as fascinating figures. This image continued in countless films, series, and songs. From Martin Scorsese's Goodfellas to television series such as The Sopranos, a cultural cosmos developed in which the Mafia played a central role, often as a symbol of power, rebellion, and independence. In Italy itself, too, the Mafia was processed in culture. Writers such as Leonardo Sciascia and Roberto Saviano took a critical look at their role. Saviano's book Camorra, which ruthlessly exposed the Camorra's involvement in Naples, became an international bestseller, but also brought the author lifelong threats. To this day, Saviano lives under constant police protection, a sign of how real the power of the Mafia is when it is publicly attacked. Films, plays, and music in Italy take up the topic again and again and show that the Mafia is not only a problem of crime, but also an issue of identity and social conflict. The aftermath of the Mafia is also noticeable economically. Entire regions of southern Italy still suffer under the control of the clans, which prevent investment, block innovation, and paralyze companies through blackmail. Many young people leave these regions because they see no future there, which reinforces the vicious circle of poverty, dependence, and mafia-like control. This makes the Mafia not only a criminal, but also a social and economic problem that has been slowing down Italy's development for decades. At the international level, the Mafia has long been an integral part of the image of Italy. For many people abroad, the connection between Italy and the Mafia is almost self-evident, a cliché that characterizes tourism, media, and culture. While Italy is admired for its art, cuisine, and fashion, the shadow of the Mafia remains part of its image. This is a burden for many Italians because it distorts the image of the country and reduces complex social realities to a cliché. But the cultural processing also has a positive side. Films, books, and documentaries have created an awareness that might not have existed without them. They have helped to make the Mafia visible, to address its crimes, and to initiate discussions. In Italy in particular, a strong civil society has formed that tries to counter the Mafia through cultural projects, educational programs, and commemorative events. Organizations such as Libera, founded by Father Luigi Chiodi, fight for the use of confiscated Mafia property for social projects and show that territory and influence can be wrested from the clans. In retrospect, it is clear that the Mafia is not only a criminal organization, but has become a cultural symbol. It stands for power and violence, but also for the ability to adapt and infiltrate societies. Their portrayal in the media fluctuates between fascination, disgust, between myth and reality. The aftermath is therefore complex. It shapes politics, blocks the economy, influences social life, and is at the same time a central motif in global culture. The challenge for Italy and the world is to distinguish between myth and reality. Because as long as the Mafia is romanticized, it will remain an attractive model for people seeking power and wealth. But their real impact, murder, extortion, corruption, and destruction of livelihoods must not be forgotten. Culture and the media have a responsibility to make this ambivalence visible, and not to glorify the Mafia, but to show it for what it is, a destructive force that weakens societies. In the end, the Mafia is more than a criminal organization. It is a symbol of the interplay of tradition and modernity, of violence and culture, of illegality and apparent legitimacy. Its aftermath extends far beyond Italy, and its image in the media and society shows that it has become a global myth, a myth whose shadow is still felt today.